The dangerous truth about the rarest personality type on Earth is not found in its scarcity, nor in the romantic mythology built around it, but in the psychological burden it carries from the very beginning of life. This personality does not experience rarity as privilege, it experiences it as exile. From early childhood, such individuals sense that they are oriented differently from the world around them, not in obvious ways that attract attention, but in subtle, internal ways that shape how they perceive meaning, conflict, time, and responsibility. They do not merely think differently, they experience reality through a lens that is inwardly complex, symbolically charged, and morally weighted. This difference often remains unnamed, yet it is felt constantly, like an invisible pressure between the self and the world. In psychological typology, it has long been observed that certain configurations of perception and judgment are statistically uncommon. In psychological types, it is argued that consciousness develops along preferred pathways, privileging certain functions while relegating others to the unconscious. The rarest personalities emerge when these pathways diverge sharply from the collective norm. Such individuals are not simply introverted or intuitive or reflective, they are structured around an inward orientation that prioritizes meaning over consensus and inner coherence over external validation. This makes them difficult to classify, often misunderstood, and frequently projected upon. The danger begins with this projection. Because these individuals do not immediately reveal themselves through conventional social signals, others fill the gap with fantasy. They are seen as wise, mysterious, gifted, aloof, or morally superior, depending on the observer's needs. In Aeon, it is described how projection attaches archetypal expectations to individuals who appear psychologically opaque. The rare personality becomes a screen for collective longing. This is dangerous not only for others, but for the individual themselves. To be unconsciously elevated is to be silently burdened. The psyche is pressed into roles it never chose. Internally, the rarest personality type is characterized by an intense dialogue between conscious values and unconscious material. The boundary between inner and outer worlds is unusually permeable. Thoughts carry emotional weight. Emotions carry symbolic meaning. Dreams are vivid, often prophetic in tone, as described in Dreams and the Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. This depth of inner life can be a source of creativity and insight, but it also creates vulnerability. When the inner world is rich and demanding, the outer world can feel thin, noisy, and intrusive. The individual may withdraw not out of arrogance, but out of psychic necessity. This withdrawal is frequently misinterpreted. In cultures that reward speed, visibility, and constant affirmation, inwardly oriented individuals appear distant or disengaged. Yet inwardness is not absence. It is a different form of presence, one that listens before it speaks and observes before it acts. The danger arises when this inward orientation is not supported by sufficient grounding in external reality. In the relations between the ego and the unconscious, it is warned that when the ego becomes too identified with inner contents, inflation occurs. The individual may begin to confuse inner intensity with objective truth. This is one of the central risks of the rarest personality type, the temptation to mistake depth for destiny. Because their inner experiences feel profound, they may assume these experiences grant them special authority or exemption from ordinary constraints. This is not arrogance in the crude sense. It is a subtle psychological imbalance. The psyche, intoxicated by its own symbolic richness, loses its corrective relationship with reality. History is filled with examples of sensitive, inwardly gifted individuals who collapsed under this imbalance, mistaking intuition for omniscience and vision for certainty. Other psychological traditions recognize this danger as well. William James warned of the overbelief, the tendency to absolutize subjective experience. Rollo may emphasize that creativity without discipline deteriorates into chaos. Even Abraham Maslow noted that self-actualization requires integration, not escape from limitation. The rare personality often struggles here because limitation feels like betrayal of inner truth. Yet without limitation, the psyche fragments. Another danger lies in chronic misunderstanding. When an individual repeatedly experiences that their inner motivations are misread or dismissed, they may internalize the belief that authentic expression is futile. Over time, this leads to concealment. The person learns to present a simplified version of themselves to function socially, while their true psychological life remains hidden. In the development of personality, it is suggested that such splits weaken vitality. Energy is consumed not by growth, but by containment. This concealment, while adaptive, has long-term consequences. The individual may become skilled at appearing functional, while feeling internally disconnected. Relationships feel partial. Conversations skim the surface. The rare personality then faces a painful paradox. The deeper they are, the lonelier they become. Loneliness here is not the absence of people, but the absence of recognition. This state can quietly erode mental health, leading to depression, anxiety, or a persistent sense of unreality. The danger intensifies when moral seriousness enters the picture. Many of the rarest personalities exhibit an early and intense concern with ethics, meaning, and responsibility. They feel accountable not only for their actions, but for their thoughts and intentions. In Modern Man, in Search of a Soul, it is argued that such moral sensitivity is both a gift and a burden. When unbalanced, it becomes self-punishing. The individual holds themselves to standards that are internally absolute but externally invisible. Failure feels catastrophic, even when no one else notices. This moral intensity often collides with a world that operates pragmatically. Compromise, ambiguity, and expedience dominate social systems. The rare personality experiences this as corruption or emptiness. Disillusionment follows. Some retreat further inward, others become rigid, and still others burn out entirely. Viktor Frankl observed that meaning-seeking individuals suffer uniquely in meaningless environments. Their suffering is not alleviated by comfort because the wound is existential. The rarest personality type is also particularly susceptible to shadow possession. Because they value ideals so highly, they are prone to repress traits that contradict their self-image. Anger, ambition, envy, and desire are pushed into the unconscious. In Aeon, it is emphasized that the more an individual identifies with the light, the darker the shadow becomes. When the shadow eventually breaks through, it does so with disproportionate force, shocking both the individual and those around them. This can manifest as sudden emotional outbursts, drastic life changes, or moral reversals. Observers may feel betrayed, saying, "I never expected this from you." But psychologically, such eruptions are not betrayals, they are compensations. The psyche demands balance. The danger lies not in having a shadow, but in denying it. The rare personality, precisely because of their ideals, must work harder than most to integrate their darker aspects consciously. Another subtle risk is chronic over-responsibility. Because these individuals often perceive patterns and consequences others overlook, they feel compelled to intervene, to warn, to correct. They carry the weight of foresight. In Civilization in Transition, it is suggested that those who perceive collective shadows often suffer personally. The rare personality becomes a container for unacknowledged truths. This role is unsustainable if not shared. Over time, it leads to exhaustion and bitterness. Social feedback further complicates this burden. When the rare personality speaks difficult truths, they are often met with discomfort or resistance. Silence follows. The individual learns that insight is not always welcome. This creates a dilemma: speak and be rejected, or remain silent and feel complicit. Neither option satisfies the psyche. The danger here is cynicism. When idealism collapses into contempt, psychological vitality drains away. Yet perhaps the most dangerous truth is this: the rarest personality type is not inherently wise, healed, or evolved. Rarity does not equal maturity. In the undiscovered self, it is warned against confusing psychological differentiation with moral superiority. Without conscious development, rarity becomes distortion. The individual may cling to their difference as identity, resisting growth because growth threatens the very thing that makes them feel special. Growth, however, is unavoidable. The psyche pushes toward integration, regardless of preference. For the rare personality, this means learning to translate inner depth into lived reality, to test intuition against experience, and to accept that being uncommon does not exempt one from ordinary human limitations. It means learning to relate without performing, to stand without withdrawing, and to act without needing certainty. This developmental path is slow and often lonely. Few models exist. The individual must invent their own language for experience, drawing from psychology, philosophy, art, and lived struggle. In Symbols of Transformation, it is suggested that such individuals function as bridges between unconscious material and conscious culture. But bridges endure strain from both sides. Without sufficient support, they crack. The danger, then, is not that the rarest personality is too different for the world, but that the world offers too few structures to hold them. Without reflection, mentorship, and disciplined self-examination, their gifts turn inward and consume them. Sensitivity becomes fragility, insight becomes paralysis, idealism becomes despair, and yet within this danger lies a quiet imperative. The psyche does not generate such configurations by accident. Psychological diversity serves a function even when it comes at a cost. Those who carry uncommon inner structures are tasked not with escaping humanity, but with deepening it. This task cannot be completed in isolation, nor can it be rushed. It requires enduring misunderstanding without internal collapse, holding complexity without arrogance, and remaining open to correction without abandoning inner truth. The rarest personality type stands at a fault line between inner meaning and outer reality, between what is sensed and what is accepted, between what could be and what is. The danger is that this tension can either forge depth or fracture the self, depending on whether the individual learns to bear it consciously. And it is precisely at this point where difference becomes responsibility and insight demands embodiment that the true psychological story of this personality begins to unfold, not as a conclusion or resolution, but as a continuing confrontation with the limits of self, the demands of reality, and the unfinished task of becoming something that has never been fully modeled before, something that must be discovered through ongoing tension rather than final answers, through lived engagement rather than withdrawal, through a willingness to remain in the struggle without retreating into either illusion or despair, and to keep moving forward even when the path ahead refuses to clarify itself. In this continued unfolding, the rarest personality type often reaches a stage where inner tension becomes so familiar that it risks being mistaken for identity itself. The individual may unconsciously define themselves by struggle, depth, or difference, turning a psychological condition into a self-concept. This is another hidden danger. When suffering becomes identity, growth feels like betrayal. The psyche resists resolution because resolution threatens the meaning it has extracted from pain. In earlier psychological writings on neurosis and character formation, it is suggested that symptoms can become investments. They provide coherence when other forms of coherence are lacking. For the rare personality, existential struggle can become such an investment. At this point, the individual may feel a subtle sense of superiority, not the loud arrogance of domination, but a quiet conviction of being more aware, more sensitive, more awake than others. This conviction is rarely articulated openly, yet it shapes perception. Ordinary conversations feel trivial. Practical concerns feel shallow. The world appears asleep. In Aeon, it is warned that identification with consciousness itself is a form of inflation. Awareness becomes an idol. The ego mistakes its vantage point for transcendence, forgetting that insight without humility collapses into isolation. This inflation is often reinforced by external feedback. In certain cultural niches, the rare personality is celebrated, labeled, and mythologized. Online typologies, spiritual communities, and intellectual circles elevate difference into destiny. While recognition can be relieving, it also carries a narcotic quality. The individual begins to perform their rarity, subtly exaggerating traits that confirm their identity. What began as an unconscious configuration becomes a conscious mask. The psyche loses contact with its own spontaneity. Depth psychology has long cautioned against this phenomenon. In The Persona and the Unconscious, it is described how even authenticity can harden into role-playing when it becomes socially rewarded. The rare personality, already prone to inward identification, is especially vulnerable. The danger is not that they are misunderstood, but that they are understood too narrowly. Once named, the mystery contracts. The individual begins to live up to a description rather than listening to the evolving demands of the psyche. Meanwhile, neglected functions continue to press from below. Psychological typology emphasizes that every strength casts a shadow. The rare personality often excels in abstract meaning, intuition, and ethical reflection, while neglecting sensation, practicality, or emotional immediacy. These neglected functions do not disappear. They surface in distorted forms: impulsive decisions, physical symptoms, compulsive habits, or sudden attractions that seem to contradict the individual's self-image. In psychological types, it is emphasized that one-sided development invites unconscious compensation. Balance is not optional, it is enforced by the psyche. Relationships become a primary arena for this compensation. The rare personality may find themselves drawn to individuals who embody what they lack: groundedness, decisiveness, emotional directness. These relationships feel magnetic and destabilizing. At first, they appear to offer completion. Over time, conflict emerges. Each partner unconsciously demands that the other carry disowned aspects of the self. Without awareness, these dynamics lead to disillusionment. With awareness, they become opportunities for integration. However, integration is rarely romantic. It requires the individual to descend from inner abstraction into lived limitation. The rare personality must learn to tolerate boredom, routine, and imperfection without interpreting them as existential threats. This is deeply challenging for a psyche oriented toward meaning. Yet in the development personality, it is suggested that true individuation includes the ordinary. The extraordinary cannot remain isolated without becoming unreal. Work life poses another significant challenge. The rare personality often struggles within systems that prioritize efficiency over depth. They may feel alienated in hierarchical structures, frustrated by superficial metrics of success. Some withdraw, others over-adapt, masking their inner resistance behind competence. Both strategies carry costs. Over time, the individual may experience a sense of inner betrayal, a quiet despair that no external achievement alleviates. This despair is not laziness or entitlement, it is the psyche signaling misalignment. Existential psychologists such as Rollo may noted that meaning cannot be substituted with productivity. For the rare personality, this insight is not theoretical, it is lived. Yet knowing this does not automatically resolve the conflict. Economic reality, social expectation, and personal responsibility exert pressure. The danger lies in chronic postponement, the belief that authentic life will begin later, once conditions improve. The psyche, however, does not wait indefinitely. Deferred meaning curdles into resentment. At this stage, many rare personalities experience a crisis that appears externally disproportionate: burnout, sudden withdrawal, loss of motivation, or a collapse of previously stable functioning. Observers are confused. The individual appeared capable, insightful, even successful. What has failed is not capacity but coherence. The inner and outer lives have drifted too far apart. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, it is argued that such crises are not pathological interruptions but calls to reorientation. The psyche demands renegotiation of values. This renegotiation often involves relinquishing the fantasy of being special in favor of being whole. Wholeness requires humility, the acceptance that insight does not absolve one from the discipline of life. It requires learning skills that feel beneath one's depth, engaging tasks that offer no symbolic reward, and entering relationships without the guarantee of profound recognition. For the rare personality, this feels like descent. Psychologically, it is incarnation. The process resembles what earlier depth psychology described as the confrontation with the inferior function. The individual must consciously engage what they least value and least trust. This engagement is uncomfortable because it threatens identity. Yet without it, the psyche remains lopsided. Integration does not mean abandoning intuition or depth. It means anchoring them. Meaning must find form, or it dissipates. As this anchoring begins, the individual may notice a subtle shift in how they experience others. People once dismissed as shallow reveal unexpected complexity. Conversations once avoided offer unexpected warmth. The world regains texture. This shift does not eliminate difference, but it softens alienation. The rare personality remains uncommon in orientation, but less isolated in experience. Difference becomes a perspective, not a wall. Still, the tension never disappears entirely. There are moments when the individual feels the old distance returning, when the world seems unbearably loud or morally incoherent. The temptation to withdraw resurfaces. At these moments, the psyche tests whether integration has taken root or whether retreat remains the primary defense. Each cycle deepens awareness. The individual learns that withdrawal can be chosen consciously, rather than enacted compulsively. Another danger emerges here, the savior complex. As the rare personality gains maturity, others may seek their counsel, insight, or emotional presence. The individual, sensitive to suffering and meaning, may feel obligated to respond. In the psychology of the transference, it is cautioned that projection of wisdom invites counter-projection of responsibility. Without boundaries, the rare personality becomes a container for others' unresolved material. Exhaustion follows. The gift turns toxic. Learning to refuse this role is psychologically essential. Refusal does not negate compassion, it preserves it. The individual must accept that insight does not confer obligation to rescue. This acceptance often provokes guilt, especially in morally serious personalities. Yet guilt here is another form of inflation, the belief that one is uniquely responsible for what others cannot carry. Letting go of this belief restores proportion. As proportion returns, the individual's relationship to their own rarity changes. It is no longer a burden to explain or a badge to defend. It becomes simply a fact of psychological orientation. In the undiscovered self, it is suggested that individuality is real only when it no longer needs to assert itself. The rare personality reaches maturity when it can inhabit its nature without needing recognition or exemption. At this point, the danger shifts again. Complacency threatens. Having survived isolation, inflation, burnout, and integration, the individual may assume the work is done. But the psyche does not conclude, it circulates. New life stages reactivate old patterns in new forms. Aging, loss, responsibility, and mortality bring fresh demands. The rare personality must continually retranslate inner meaning into changing outer conditions. What distinguishes psychological maturity here is not stability, but responsiveness. The individual remains attentive to imbalance, willing to descend again when necessary. Depth is no longer dramatized, it is lived quietly. Insight informs action rather than replacing it. The psyche finds a rhythm between inner listening and outer participation. The dangerous truth then continues to unfold. The rarest personality type is not endangered because it is fragile, but because it is intense. Intensity without structure destroys itself. Structure without intensity becomes dead. The task is to hold both. This holding is not heroic, it is daily, often invisible. It involves choosing engagement when withdrawal is easier, humility when insight tempts superiority, and patience when urgency demands certainty. Such individuals often leave subtle traces rather than monuments. They influence conversations, shape values, and ask questions that linger. Their impact is rarely immediate or measurable. This can feel unsatisfying to a psyche that senses its own potential. Yet depth works slowly. In Civilization in Transition, it is suggested that psychological change precedes cultural change. Those who carry uncommon configurations participate in this process whether they intend to or not. And so the story continues without resolution. The rare personality remains suspended between inner vision and outer reality, never fully at home in either, yet capable of mediating between them. The danger persists, not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a tension to be borne consciously. It is this tension that keeps the psyche alive, that prevents collapse into conformity or dissolution into abstraction, and that continually presses the individual to return to the unfinished work of becoming, work that does not end, does not announce itself, and does not reward certainty, but instead demands presence, restraint, and the courage to remain psychologically awake in a world that often prefers sleep. As this psychological wakefulness deepens, the rarest personality type often becomes acutely aware of a paradox that few others consciously confront. The more clearly one perceives complexity, the harder it becomes to act decisively. Insight multiplies perspectives, and perspectives slow movement. Where others choose quickly by habit, convention, or impulse, this individual hesitates, not from indecision, but from an almost painful awareness of consequence. Every choice reverberates inwardly, carrying ethical, emotional, and symbolic weight. Action is never merely practical, it feels existential. This is another quiet danger, one that rarely announces itself as pathology, but steadily erodes confidence in one's ability to live spontaneously. In psychological literature, this tension appears repeatedly. In psychological types, it is observed that highly differentiated, intuitive, and reflective personalities often struggle with execution because action forces the psyche into the realm of limitation, where ideals must be reduced to form. To act is to exclude possibilities, and exclusion feels like violence to a mind trained to perceive wholes. Over time, this reluctance can harden into paralysis. Life begins to feel like a series of missed entrances, not because opportunities were absent, but because none felt sufficiently aligned with inner truth. This paralysis is often misunderstood as passivity or fear of failure. In reality, it is fear of distortion. The rare personality senses that poorly aligned action does not merely fail externally, it injures the psyche internally. Each misaligned choice feels like a betrayal of something sacred, yet life does not wait for perfect alignment. The psyche is eventually forced to confront the fact that meaning is not discovered prior to action, but clarified through it. This realization arrives slowly and often painfully. Another layer of danger emerges in the realm of self-criticism. Because these individuals perceive ideals so vividly, they judge themselves relentlessly against them. Standards are internal, absolute, and unforgiving. Praise from others rarely penetrates. Criticism confirms what the inner voice already suspects. In the development of personality, it is noted that such internal authority can become tyrannical when it is not balanced by self-compassion. The rare personality may appear confident or composed, while inwardly waging a constant war against perceived inadequacy. This inner war drains vitality, energy that could be used for creativity, connection, or rest is consumed by self-monitoring. Over time, joy becomes suspect. Pleasure feels unearned. Rest feels irresponsible. The individual becomes productive but brittle, insightful but exhausted. This condition often precedes psychological collapse, not because the individual is weak, but because they are overextended by invisible demands. The unconscious responds to such imbalance through symptoms. Anxiety emerges without clear cause. Sleep becomes disturbed. Motivation fluctuates unpredictably. These are not malfunctions, they are signals. In the structure and dynamics of the psyche, IT is emphasized that symptoms are communications. They express what consciousness refuses to hear. For the rare personality, symptoms often demand a renegotiation of standards, a confrontation with the belief that worth must be earned through depth, sacrifice, or exceptionalism. Yet relinquishing exceptionalism feels like erasure. If one is not defined by rarity, by insight, by moral seriousness, then who is one? This question strikes at the core of identity. The psyche resists answering it because the answer cannot be conceptual. It must be lived. Identity must shift from being special to being present, from being rare to being real. This shift is psychologically destabilizing because it removes the scaffolding that once held the self together. During this destabilization, the individual may experience periods of emptiness. The inner world, once crowded with ideas and symbols, grows quiet. This silence can feel terrifying, as if meaning itself has vanished. Many attempt to escape this silence by consuming information, returning to old identities, or provoking intensity through conflict. But psychologically, this silence often marks a transition. The psyche is clearing space. Old meanings have exhausted themselves, new ones have not yet formed. In alchemical psychology, this phase resembles the nigredo, the darkening, the dissolution of former structures. Though the term is symbolic, the experience is concrete. Confidence dissolves, direction blurs. The individual feels stripped of orientation. Yet it is precisely here that something essential becomes possible, the emergence of a more grounded self, no longer fueled by difference alone, but by lived coherence. As this process unfolds, the rare personality begins to sense a shift in values. Depth remains important, but it no longer demands constant intensity. Meaning is found in continuity as much as in revelation. Ordinary moments regain dignity. The psyche learns that truth does not always arrive as insight, sometimes it arrives as endurance. This learning is humbling. It contradicts earlier fantasies of destiny or exception, but it stabilizes the psyche. Relationships often change at this stage. The individual becomes less interested in being understood completely and more interested in being present. They listen without scanning for depth. They speak without rehearsing significance. This does not make them shallow, it makes them available. In the psychology of the transference, it is suggested that genuine relationship begins when projection withdraws. For the rare personality, this withdrawal allows others to appear not as symbols or disappointments, but as humans. Work, too, begins to transform. Instead of seeking the perfect vocation that will express the totality of the self, the individual may commit to work that is good enough, work that allows for contribution without demanding total identification. This choice often feels like compromise, but psychologically it is integration. It allows the psyche to distribute itself across life, rather than concentrating all meaning in a single role. Still, the rare personality does not lose its sensitivity to incongruence. They remain attuned to falseness, manipulation, and moral evasion. The difference is that they no longer feel compelled to confront every instance. Discernment replaces urgency. Silence becomes a choice rather than a wound. This restraint protects the psyche from constant activation. It also deepens credibility. When such individuals speak now, they do so selectively, and their words carry weight precisely because they are not constant. Another subtle danger persists, however, the temptation to retreat permanently into private meaning. Having learned the cost of exposure, the individual may guard their inner life too closely. Privacy hardens into secrecy, secrecy into isolation. Psychology warns that individuation does not culminate in withdrawal from the world, but in conscious participation. In Civilization in Transition, it is argued that individuals who carry psychological insight have a responsibility not to preach, but to remain engaged. Engagement need not be loud or public, it must simply be real. As life continues, new challenges arise that test this engagement. Loss, aging, failure, and mortality introduce forms of meaning that cannot be symbolized away. The rare personality, once oriented toward abstract significance, must now face finitude directly. This encounter is sobering. Insight offers no immunity. The psyche confronts its own limits, and with them, the universality it once resisted. Difference softens into kinship. This confrontation with finitude often brings a surprising relief. The burden of being rare lightens when one recognizes that suffering, confusion, and uncertainty are shared conditions. The psyche no longer needs to justify its pain through uniqueness. Pain becomes human rather than exceptional. This shift reduces isolation. It also grounds compassion, not as an ideal, but as recognition. At this stage, the rare personality often becomes less visible, but more stable. They no longer seek to be seen, yet they are present. Their influence is subtle, woven into relationships, decisions, and the tone of spaces they inhabit. They may not be recognized as rare at all. Psychologically, this invisibility is not a loss. It is a sign of integration. The self no longer requires differentiation as proof of existence. Still, the original tension never vanishes completely. Moments of inner distance return. Periods of withdrawal recur. The difference now lies in awareness. The individual recognizes these movements as rhythms rather than crises. Withdrawal becomes rest. Return becomes choice. The psyche breathes. The dangerous truth then continues to reveal itself layer by layer. The rarest personality type is not endangered by the world alone, nor saved by insight alone. It is endangered by imbalance, by leaning too far into inner meaning without outer grounding, or into adaptation without inner truth. Survival, in the deepest sense, depends on learning to move between worlds without collapsing into either. This movement requires ongoing humility. Each phase of growth reveals the limitations of the previous one. Certainty gives way to complexity. Complexity gives way to restraint. Restraint gives way to quiet participation. At no point does the psyche arrive at a final form. Any attempt to fix identity arrests development. What remains constant is the demand for consciousness. The rare personality cannot afford unconsciousness. It amplifies distortion, nor can it afford withdrawal. It intensifies isolation. The only sustainable path lies in conscious tension, remaining awake to inner life while staying engaged with outer reality, even when that engagement feels imperfect, incomplete, or unworthy of the psyche's depth. And so the individual continues, not toward resolution, but toward responsiveness. Each stage brings new dangers and new capacities. The psyche learns through exposure, retreat, confrontation, and return. The rare personality does not become less rare in structure. but less imprisoned by it. Difference ceases to be destiny and becomes perspective. Insight ceases to be identity and becomes tool. Meaning ceases to be an internal possession and becomes a lived relationship with the world as it is, unfinished, demanding, and resistant to final explanation. As this lived relationship with the world deepens, the rarest personality type begins to encounter a further and more unsettling realization that insight does not grant control. For much of their inner life, these individuals have relied on understanding as a means of safety. To comprehend something was to neutralize it. To name a pattern was to feel protected from its power. But reality resists this logic. Loss still arrives. Betrayal still wounds. Chaos still interrupts the most carefully constructed inner frameworks. The psyche is forced to relinquish the illusion that awareness equals mastery. This relinquishment is psychologically profound. It marks the collapse of a subtle defense mechanism, intellectualized meaning-making. In earlier phases, insight served as armor. Pain could be interpreted, symbolized, contextualized, and therefore held at a distance. But eventually, the psyche insists on immediacy. Certain experiences demand to be felt without explanation. In the transcendent function, it is suggested that transformation occurs when opposites are held without premature resolution. For the rare personality, this means allowing vulnerability without translating it instantly into understanding. This is deeply uncomfortable. Without interpretation, the psyche feels naked. The individual may experience raw fear, grief, or longing that cannot be elevated into insight. These emotions feel primitive compared to the refined inner world the person has cultivated. Yet they are not regressions, they are integrations. The psyche is reclaiming parts of itself that were bypassed in the pursuit of meaning. As this happens, emotional life gains texture. Feelings are no longer immediately evaluated for significance. They are experienced as states that pass through the body and psyche. This embodiment grounds the individual. It also disrupts the old hierarchy in which thinking and intuition dominated while sensation and effect were secondary. In psychological types, it is emphasized that psychological balance requires the participation of all functions. The rare personality's danger has always been imbalance, not difference. With embodiment comes another shift. Time perception changes. Earlier, life may have felt like a waiting room for the real moment, when purpose would crystallize, when the right path would appear, when inner and outer would finally align. Now, the present moment gains legitimacy, not because it is perfect, but because it is unavoidable. The psyche begins to invest in what is rather than what could be. This investment is subtle but stabilizing. However, investing in the present also exposes the individual to disappointment in a new way. When one is fully present, illusions are to maintain. Relationships reveal their limits. Work reveals its constraints. The world reveals its indifference. The rare personality, once sustained by inner richness, now faces external reality more directly. The danger here is disillusionment without retreat. The challenge is to remain engaged without demanding that reality justify itself. This demand often surfaces unconsciously as moral outrage. The rare personality, attuned to ideals, may react strongly to injustice, hypocrisy, or superficiality. Such reactions are not misplaced, but they can become corrosive if they harden into contempt. In civilization in transition, it is observed that moral insight without humility fractures community. The individual must learn to distinguish between discernment and disdain. One clarifies, the other isolates. As discernment matures, the rare personality becomes more selective in where and how they invest energy. They recognize that not every environment deserves their depth, and not every conflict requires their participation. This selectivity is not withdrawal, it is stewardship of psychological resources. Energy is finite. To expend it indiscriminately is to invite depletion. Yet selectivity introduces another risk: detachment masquerading as wisdom. The individual may rationalize disengagement as maturity, when in fact it is fear of disappointment. Depth psychology warns that avoidance often disguises itself as discernment. The psyche must continually test its motives. Am I stepping back because this does not matter, or because it matters too much? This question has no permanent answer. It must be asked repeatedly. As life progresses, the rare personality may find that their difference becomes less dramatic internally. What once felt like a defining gulf now feels like a nuance. This does not mean the psyche has become ordinary. It means it has become integrated. The individual no longer measures themselves constantly against the world. Comparison loses urgency. Identity stabilizes around lived values rather than abstract self-concepts. This stabilization often coincides with a reduced need to explain oneself. Earlier, the rare personality may have felt compelled to justify their pace, their needs, their withdrawal, their intensity. Explanation served as a bridge and a defense. Now, silence becomes sufficient. Not all truths need articulation. Some are simply enacted. In the undiscovered self, it is suggested that maturity expresses itself more through being than through argument. Still, the individual remains aware of the gap between inner complexity and outer expression. Language feels insufficient. Much of what is lived cannot be communicated without distortion. This acceptance marks another psychological shift. The need for perfect articulation relaxes. Misunderstanding becomes tolerable. The psyche no longer depends on recognition to confirm its reality. Yet the world continues to provoke. Systems remain unjust. Relationships remain imperfect. Mortality approaches. The rare personality cannot retreat into inner meaning alone without becoming irrelevant to life, nor can they dissolve into activism or conformity without losing themselves. The tension persists. What changes is the individual's capacity to hold it without dramatization. As aging enters the picture, a further layer of danger and wisdom emerges. The rare personality often ages internally faster than externally. They confront existential questions early. But physical aging introduces new constraints that insight cannot override. Energy wanes. Recovery slows. The psyche must adapt to limitation in the body. This adaptation can feel humiliating to a mind accustomed to transcendence. Yet it also deepens realism. With aging, the urgency to prove or fulfill diminishes. The rare personality may begin to measure life less by potential and more by coherence. What matters is not how much was understood, but how much was lived. Regret may surface, not for failures, but for excessive hesitation. This regret is not paralyzing, it is clarifying. It sharpens attention to what remains possible. At this stage, mentorship often becomes meaningful, whether formal or informal. The rare personality, having navigated complexity, offers perspective rather than prescription. They recognize that insight cannot be transferred whole, it must be earned. Their role is not to enlighten, but to accompany. This stance protects against the savior complex that once threatened them. The psyche, having endured multiple cycles of inflation and collapse, now recognizes warning signs earlier. Over-identification with ideals triggers caution. Withdrawal triggers inquiry. Emotional numbness triggers rest. These responses are not automatic, they are practiced. Psychological maturity here resembles skill rather than state. Despite this skill, uncertainty remains. The rare personality never arrives at a final self-definition. Identity remains fluid, responsive to inner and outer seeds. Hanj. This fluidity, once terrifying, becomes a source of resilience. The individual no longer needs to know who they are in advance. They trust the process of becoming. The dangerous truth thus continues to unfold not as a singular revelation, but as a lifelong negotiation. The rarest personality type is dangerous to itself when it clings to exceptionalism, when it substitutes insight for embodiment, when it mistakes withdrawal for depth or superiority for clarity. It becomes viable when it accepts ordinariness without surrendering meaning, when it allows life to correct its abstractions, and when it remains in dialogue with reality rather than retreating into interpretation. This dialogue is never smooth. It is marked by missteps, returns, and revisions. The psyche does not reward consistency, it rewards honesty. For the rare personality, honesty means acknowledging both the gift and the cost of their configuration. It means resisting the temptation to romanticize difference or to apologize for it. Difference must be lived responsibly, not displayed or denied. Ultimately, the rarest personality type carries a particular kind of tension into the world, a tension between what is sensed inwardly and what is permitted outwardly. This tension does not resolve, it ripens. When born unconsciously, it fractures the self. When born consciously, it becomes a quiet force that shapes decisions, relationships, and values in ways that are rarely visible but deeply consequential. And so the individual continues, not seeking safety in certainty nor refuge in isolation, but learning to stand within contradiction without collapse, to act without total assurance, to relate without total understanding, and to remain present in a world that neither mirrors nor fully accommodates their inner life, yet continually invites them to participate anyway, asking again and again whether they will retreat into the comfort of inward abstraction or risk the unfinished, demanding, and imperfect task of living meaning in contact with reality. In the end, the dangerous truth about the rarest personality type is not that such individuals are too different for the world, but that they are tempted to live as if difference alone were a destiny. Their true challenge is not survival, nor misunderstanding, nor isolation, but the lifelong task of integration, of learning how to let depth serve life rather than replace it. Insight without embodiment becomes sterile, just as participation without inner truth becomes empty. The psyche reaches its fullest expression not when it retreats into rarity, but when it accepts the burden of being human among humans, carrying its sensitivity, perception, and conscience into the imperfect fabric of ordinary existence. This conclusion does not offer comfort in the form of final answers, because psychological maturity never grants them. What it offers instead is orientation, a recognition that meaning is not something the rare personality possesses, but something it must continually enact. The gift of seeing deeply becomes a responsibility to live honestly, to act without complete certainty, and to remain engaged even when the world feels coarse, resistant, or insufficient. When this responsibility is accepted, rarity ceases to be a source of danger and becomes a quiet form of service, not through grand gestures or exceptional identities, but through the steady courage to remain awake, grounded, and present in a world that will never fully understand the inner life, yet is irrevocably shaped by those willing to live it with integrity.